Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robyn Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This time I'm joined by Professor George Burrows, Professor of Music and Theatre at the Faculty of Creative and Cultural Industries here at the university. Together we'll be discovering how jazz music has delivered innovation and cultural change by being the original rule-breaker of the 20th century. We're used to modern-day pop and rock stars pushing boundaries and creating headlines, whether through their own music or off-stage antics. But frankly, jazz has been doing the same for a lot longer and right up to the present day. We're going to travel back nearly 100 years to meet the band leader whose approach led to exciting changes to music, race and gender. A musician with such an interesting story to tell that George has written an entire book on him and his band. And the story will continue right into the 21st century as we look at the ways the art form has interacted with technology and new music styles. So George, thank you very much for joining me today.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's start our story then, back in the 1920s, 1929 to be exact. He might not be particularly well known these days, but Andy Kirk was one of the pop stars of his time, and by pop we mean popular, as the leader of a swing band. So can you just give us a bit of background on him and why you're interested in him?
I'm interested in him partly because he was neglected. And I think it's important to realise that music was very different before the war, before the Second World War. And I suppose people think of jazz and they think of Louis Armstrong, they think of perhaps Glenn Miller getting to the middle of the century, and then they might think of people like Thelonious Monk or somebody like that getting after the war. But I think it's important to realise that those people all came from established centres like Chicago and New York, and Andy Kirk didn't. He came from Kansas City. And I think that's important because he did things a little bit differently. And I think that's one of the reasons he's an innovator and why I'm interested in him.
And his career then, where did it start and how long did it span for?
His career started quite a bit before he made his first record in 1929. He was playing in other bands, and he was really playing for white society. He was playing for dancing. And then he made this recording, and he got a bit lucky. Record companies were looking for black music to record, and the success that engendered really was followed by a hit record in 1936. And after that, he carried on recording right up until the 1970s.
And what was the band in particular that you were interested in then?
So his band had various names, but they were always referred to as the Clouds of Joy. Sometimes it was called the 12 Clouds of Joy or the 11 Clouds of Joy, but it was mostly known as Andy Kirk and his Clouds of Joy. And I think that's an interesting title because clouds and joy are kind of contradictions in terms. And I think in some ways that's what you can see in his music and what makes him such an interesting innovator. And to some extent, what makes all jazz interesting. Because on the one hand, it has to conform to certain expectations, but on the other hand, it has to break free from them.
So at this sort of time, the 1920s, when this band were becoming quite big and well established, what other genres were they competing with, or was jazz the primary and swing the primary genres?
So I suppose blues was still on the scene, but it was in decline. And I think the thing was people were dancing, and they wanted music to dance to that had a beat, that was appealing, sounded contemporary. And Andy Kirk really filled that void along with other bands. And there was a massive market really to play music and to record music that people could dance to. And so the 1930s are really the era in which jazz becomes popular music, the most mainstream form of music that's conceived, particularly in America.
And you said there about dancing being the sort of main push for this genre. Why was dancing such a big thing at the time? Was it to do with things going on elsewhere outside of music?
Yeah, it was to do with social politics as much as anything else, and gender politics. There weren't many places where you could meet your partner, get close to somebody of the opposite sex or even the same sex in some locations. And I think that dancing provided a space for young people to explore relationships and to develop intimacy with people in a world where it was quite difficult after the First World War. It was a break free, really, from the previous generation that had forced in the First World War and had a kind of Edwardian stiffness. And, if you think about swing dancing, it's the jitterbug, that you get a little bit later. It's a really fluid, energetic, there's a breaking free involved in it. If you've ever done any of that kind of dance, there are moments where you break out of the rigid rules of where to put your feet and you can do something kind of freestyle. And of course that happens in jazz as well. So the music was perfectly matched to that sense of freedom that dancing offered.
And for me, when I think of like, on a Saturday night, if I want to go somewhere to go dancing, jazz is not the first genre that pops into my mind now. I mean, you've got R&B, you've got sort of electro, you've got loads of different stuff going on now. But back then, that was the popular music of its time. And there were young people going out seeking that music for some expression.
Absolutely. My grandparents met dancing. And in fact, they won a competition, which meant that they went on a second date. And this was quite common. It was quite a common phenomenon. And, Andy Kirk was playing for society functions in the middle of America. And these functions were for wealthy, white, middle to upper class people that wanted to have this moment of abandon. It might be part of a function that was organized by a social group of some sort, perhaps the Freemasons or something like that. He was in some ways connected with those circles. And they would just put on a function, a dance, and they would invite people along, and it would often be a moneymaker. And there was so much money involved that they could afford to pay a band of, say, 12, 13, 15, 20 musicians. And Andy Kirk really exploited that, So I think the whole business of dancing and its relationship to music needs more careful consideration. That's one of the reasons I wrote my book, because I think there's an interesting feedback mechanism between the beat of the band and the beat of the feet. And Andy Kirk talks about this because he played in lots of big dance halls because they built these purpose-built dance halls. And in fact, we have some of them in Portsmouth. Some of the places you can go to a club in Portsmouth were dance halls in the 1930s. And they had big floors that were polished and wooden surfaces. And you could literally hear the feet dancing on the floor. So you had to follow the beat of the dancers as much as the dancers had to follow the beat of the band. Part of what I'm interested in is how the feel of dancing relates to the feel of the music and how they influence one another. Because I'm interested in how people use and connect with music.
This is going to go a bit off piece, but what you said there about having the beats going alongside the music, that reminds me of Queen and the We Will Rock You, the stomping of the feet and the clapping of the hands, that kind of audience participation in music, making them feel as though they're part of the band. And is that why you think possibly his band had such a huge impact, because he really brought the audience in?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of the bands of that period had a duty in their minds to do what the audience wanted to some extent. But at the same time, they were jazz musicians. They wanted to feel the freedom, the liberation. Remember, these are black musicians working in a very white social function. And so there had to be space for them to express themselves. But that space was pretty narrow because there were expectations of what a band should do. And that's why Andy Kirk's band is so interesting, because they confound expectations. They sound a little bit like what was considered at the time a very white sounding band. And they had to, because that's what their audience wanted. But within that, they were able to do subtle and interesting things to really combat that. That beat thing is kind of important because, you can be on the beat with the dancers, and you can syncopate, go against the beat. And, jazz is a syncopated music for a reason. And I could say more about that. But I think the crux of it is doing something together is great, but it gets a little boring after a while. And, We Will Rock You is fantastic. But that once you've got the audience doing that, what do? You can't really develop that, And that's really what I think jazz is so great at doing. It's able to go with and be popular and at the same time resist. And I think that resistance is important because of its roots in Black American culture and the idea of it being a space for freedom of expression. Improvisation is a sort of figure of that, if you like.
And let's just dissect what you said there a moment ago about it being, there were quite strict rules about black and white music at the time. So politically, the 20s and the 30s were quite a turbulent time for people in America who weren't white, I think it's fair to say. So what were these sort of telltale signs of if a music sort of fitted into a category of a white musician or a black musician?
Well, at the time, I suppose I'm talking now about the late 20s and early 30s, music was divided into two categories. And this was defined partly by the way that people had thought in Europe about jazz. So you had what was known as sweet music, which was fairly easily consumed, quite melodic, usually with a good beat though. And perhaps the icon of sweet music would be somebody like Paul Whiteman, who had a string of hits in the sort of late 20s, early 30s. And then on the other side of it, you would have what was known as hot jazz. And I suppose that would relate to sort of really stereotyped ideas of R&B these days. You know, it was black American music predominantly, led by figures like Louis Armstrong originally, but increasingly moving into a more broader context where both white and black bands could be considered hot. But if you were a black band recording, the expectation was that you would record hot music. And not only that, they had a special line of record labels, most of the record companies, that was explicitly for hot music. And they would often use terms like race music for that. So it was a racist marketplace. And this is why I think it's so interesting looking at a figure like Andy Kirk, because he was able to do what people expected of a black band on records, and at the same time confound their expectations. And very often people would mistake them for a white band. But to begin with, he had to convince the record producers that he fitted into the race category of music. And so he had to some extent be able to play both sides of this. And that negotiation is so interesting because it opens up what the racism that's actually going on. You know, the fact that people expect music to sound a certain way and then it suddenly doesn't. And he realized he could exploit that. And so throughout his career, he's trying to very subtly, he's not doing it like a sort of loud and out there activist, because that comes later after the war, really, that kind of attitude. He's very subtly sort of twisting what people expect and doing things that are quite exciting. And he didn't do this on his own, I should say. He had help from his band, which he had together for a long time. And Mary Lou Williams, their pianist, was also the composer of many of their pieces. And she was very clever in trying to write music that sounded both hot and black and at the same time popular. And that was quite a challenge. And I think she succeeded in that. And, you know, part of what I've been trying to do is show how that happened and the discussion that can happen through doing that kind of thing.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for talking with me, George. We can't forget that every generation has their own version of pop music or popular music. And jazz a century ago was an exciting, challenging and attitude-changing genre. If you'd like to find out more about the connections between musical theatre and jazz, Andy Kirk's trailblazing career and more, listen to the full episode of Life Solved on the University of Portsmouth website, or just search Life Solved on your favourite podcast app now. Next week, we meet two experts dedicating their time to tackling a truly mammoth crime, ice ivory. Never heard of it? Well, make sure you subscribe to Life Solved so you don't miss out. See you again next time.